Monday, and welcome to another episode of Brain Scratch Case Cracked. I'm John Lorden. Thank you so much for spending some time with me here today. Of course, Case Cracked is the show where we look into a mystery and what is the critical piece or pieces that helped solve that mystery. And for today's case, we want to start by giving a big thank you to Brain Scratcher Kelly Andrew for bringing us this case. This is one that I like to call Rings of Truth. The year's 1981, and to most people in Marshall, Illinois, the Grabby family had it all. Fred and Charlotte owned one of the largest soybean farms around. The 800-acre farm sat just west of Terre Haute, Indiana. Their daughter, Jenny, was a straight-A student and cheerleader, and her brother Jeff played on the football team. But life may not have been as cheery as it appeared on the outside. Fred and Charlotte's 23-year marriage had been filled with fights, separations, and one divorce, only to see them remarry a year later. Nothing seemed to please their intimidating 6 foot, 4-inch tall, 280-pound father. After Jenny and Jeff graduated high school, they increasingly took their mother's side during fights. The small, petite woman was 5 foot 3 inches tall and only 120 pounds, less than half the size of her husband. But the man thought nothing of beating both her and his children regularly. In April, Charlotte finally had enough and filed for divorce again. Not only was Fred still beating her and the children, but he was also cheating on her with a local woman named Vicki McAllister. Infidelity had been a problem in their marriage, but for Charlotte, McAllister was finally the last straw. As Fred moved into a cabin on their farm named Pickens Place, Jeff, who was now married, moved himself and his wife in with his mother. Unfortunately, after the move was complete, Charlotte went to Fred's cabin to take back some of her furniture and was beaten by Fred for trying to do so. She felt she had no other option but to file battery charges against her soon-to-be ex-husband. Even with these charges, after the divorce, Fred repeatedly threatened the whole family. They had all become so paranoid that Jeff, his wife Cindy, his sister Jenny, and his mother Charlotte made a pact. If one of them didn't get home by sundown and no one received an explanation, call the police. On July 24th, 1981, that pact was put to the test when Charlotte failed to come home. She had left earlier that day to work in the soybean fields and should have been home before late afternoon. When she didn't call, everyone left to search the field and surrounding buildings on her property. The only sign of Charlotte they found was in a locked machine shed. There was her tractor, along with her lunch bucket resting on the front tire. The family knew it was time to call the authorities. Jenny and Jeff were convinced that Fred had killed their mother, but they had no proof. When a thorough search of the property was conducted, investigators found Charlotte's lunchbox along with some headache medicine. Recently, she had begun suffering from painful headaches, and the medication had become something that she never left without. The next day, officers questioned Fred at Pickens Place. He claimed that the day before, he and Charlotte had a fight. He said the last time he saw her, she was driving toward a nearby interstate highway. Investigators would find her car just a few days later, 21 miles away in Terre Haute, Indiana, but there was no trace of Charlotte. When her friends were questioned, one woman claimed that on the day of the disappearance, she saw Fred speeding down the road in his pickup truck, followed by a blonde, curly-haired woman who was driving Charlotte's vehicle. The only other lead investigators had was Charlotte's safe deposit box. Jeff told authorities that on July 13th, his mother had placed important documents in the box at the local bank and gave him instructions that if she disappeared, they were to open it. On the 29th, officers drilled open the strong box and found a letter she had written. In it, she claimed that Fred had been stealing farm equipment from their property, but more ominously, she claimed that if she ever disappeared, Fred would be responsible. Even though authorities didn't feel they had enough evidence for a conviction, under pressure from Jenny and Jeff, Fred Grabby and Vicki McAllister were brought before a grand jury. Under questioning, both refused to provide any answers, taking their Fifth Amendment right to avoid self-incrimination. Because of this, the grand jury was unable to return an indictment. Jeff and Jenny tried to coerce their father into taking a lie detector test. At first, he would have nothing to do with the idea, but with more pressure, he agreed to travel to nearby Danville for testing. When they arrived, Grabby refused to take the test and left. Authorities had absolutely nothing else to go on, and by 1984, like so many other cases, Charlotte's was going cold. But her children would hear none of it. Jenny and Jeff refused to let their mother be forgotten. "I could not let it rest," Jenny would say. "I had to know what happened to my mother." Jenny, along with her husband, Darryl Livix, hired a private investigator and offered a $25,000 reward for information that could lead to the arrest and conviction of Charlotte's killer. Private investigator Charles Pearson operated a detective agency out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. When he reviewed the case, the one thing that struck him was that report about the blonde, curly-haired woman driving Charlotte's car. Evidence showed that Fred had a lot of girlfriends, but his longtime girlfriend, Vicki McAllister, had blonde, curly hair. By this time, the two had split. But when McAllister left, she didn't go far, settling in nearby Terre Haute. It seemed she had become too old for Grabby's tastes, so he seemingly traded up for a younger version. When private investigator Pearson found Vicki McAllister, she was doing what she always did, hanging out in bars, drinking beer, and playing pool. When he told her why he had tracked her down, McAllister, quote, opened up like a floodgate. She was still very upset about being dumped and was more than ready to spill everything she knew about her ex. On the day of Charlotte's disappearance, Vicki said that she and Fred had gone to the farm to collect a few 55-gallon metal drums the family owned. As they loaded one of the barrels, the couple heard Charlotte's tractor approaching. Grabby told his girlfriend to hide in the shed while he talked to his ex-wife. They started to argue loudly, first in the field and then in the tractor shed. In the shed, Fred choked her. When she was nearing death, he would release his grip to let her get air, and then he would choke her again. Eventually, he killed her. But Charlotte's ordeal was far from over. Grabby then used a grease gun to inject her body with tractor grease and placed her body in one of the 55-gallon drums in the truck bed. McAllister was instructed to drive Charlotte's green Ford LTD, which was parked nearby, and follow him across the state line to Terre Haute, where they would leave it. When they arrived back in town that night, the two drove Grabby's truck with the body still in the back and parked alongside the Wabash River. After the barrel was unloaded, it was placed under a maple tree near the shore. The contents of the barrel were doused in diesel fuel, and Grabby set it ablaze. For the entire night, he sat on the riverbank tending to the fire. Near dawn, a search team could be heard nearby, so the two loaded the barrel back into the truck and drove back to McAllister's home. At sundown, they drove to the same spot on the river from the day before and spent the rest of that night burning Charlotte's remains. When this was done, Grabby dumped the ashy contents into the river, but Charlotte's skull he threw in separately, saying, "This will make good fish bait." After relating her story to Pearson, McAllister became physically ill. She said that the murder of Charlotte Grabby was driving her crazy and affecting her health. Fortunately, Pearson was still able to convince her to go back to Marshall and testify against Grabby. Everything that Pearson brought Clark County authorities would fit the evidence they had, but without a body, they needed more than just McAllister's word. Investigators hoped the maple tree would give them some backup for her story. Luckily, she was able to take authorities directly to the spot on the river where the body was burned and to the actual tree the fire was under. From there, 2 University of Illinois scientists were called in to look for physical evidence in the tree itself. In the spring of '85, samples were taken from the trunk and branches. It was found that the growth rings bore clear signs of damage that appeared to have happened during the summer of 1981. Those samples were then tested and showed that it was in fact diesel fuel that had damaged the tree. Some of that fuel had spilled onto the ground, damaging the roots, which then affected the tree itself. They were even able to show where under the tree the fuel was burned, and It was right where McAllister said it was. Grabby was finally arrested. 4 years after Charlotte's disappearance, Fred Grabby's first murder trial took place on June 24th, 1985. Now protected by immunity from prosecution, Vicky related her story to the court. Even though Grabby had always denied any involvement in his wife's disappearance, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. Soon after, both the Grabby family home and Fred's cabin were burned in a fire that seemed like arson. Although no arrests were ever made in either of those cases, Illinois police are convinced that Fred arranged both. On July 7th, Grabby was being held in the Clark County Jail waiting for a prison transfer. At 1:45 a.m., his current girlfriend, a 26-year-old divorcee, Barbara Graham, walked into the lobby of the jail and told the attending officer that she had a love letter she wanted him to give Fred. When the officer opened the outer door to allow her entry, she pulled out a gun and shot him in the leg. As 4 more shots were fired, other officers on the premises were able to radio for backup. When Marshall police arrived and subdued Graham, she told authorities that she was in love with Grabby and was trying to break him out of jail. The food and clothing stocked in the getaway car out front supported her story. When Graham was tried, authorities said they were not even aware that the two were dating. The judge who sentenced Graham to prison was convinced that Grabby had masterminded the breakout, although authorities were unable to find any direct evidence showing that. Graham said that she was deeply in love with Grabby and wanted to help him escape from jail regardless of the consequences. A judge would sentence the divorced mother of 3 to 16 years in prison. Soon after that, defense attorneys were able to have Fred's murder conviction reversed on appeal, and a new trial was scheduled. Sadly, before he could be called to testify, Jeff Grabby, Fred's son, disappeared. According to Jeff's wife, Cindy, a month before his father's second trial was set to begin, Jeff traveled to California on business. After he arrived, she lost contact with him, and authorities had been unable to locate him. The prosecution needed a member of the family to testify, so Jenny would be called out of witness protection to testify instead. In 1987, testimony was heard from Jeff's wife, Cindy, and even Vicky McAllister also came out of witness protection to offer her testimony. The trial ended on April 12th when the jury found Fred guilty a second time and sentenced him to 75 years in prison. Sadly, as the second trial concluded, the Grabby family would receive even more terrible news. Jeff's body had been found and identified after it was pulled from the Pacific Ocean just off Seal Beach in California. He had been shot twice in the head and once in the chest. His body was then weighted with an anchor and sent to the bottom of the ocean. As strong tides pulled at the remains, the anchor shifted, allowing the body to float to the surface. Seal Beach authorities believe that the killing was drug-related, but no arrests were ever made in the murder. After the second trial, Jenny never spoke to her father again. He has absolutely no remorse, she said. None. Of her mother, she would say, "I miss her a lot. I feel like I'm the only one left, even though my dad is alive. My husband comes from a good family, and he and his relatives and my kids, they keep me going." Jeff lies next to Charlotte's empty grave in a cemetery in Carlisle, Indiana, the town where she grew up. Jenny and Cindy still live in Marshall, Illinois. Fred Grabby is incarcerated at the Menard Penitentiary in Chester, Illinois, where he will be eligible for parole on October 22nd, 2022. Case cracked. I'd like to give a big thank you to the Chicago Tribune for its excellent coverage, the LA Times, Ravellaw.com, UPI.com, newspapers.com, Forensic Files, Now.com, and of course the amazing Christy Arnhart for researching and writing all this up. I just can't believe how this story unfolds and keeps unfolding. Just when you think it's going to end, all of a sudden there's some new twist. And most of them seem like it's Fred taking another chance, taking another shot, or possibly orchestrating these things even after he's incarcerated somehow. And it really boggles my mind that they haven't been able to find any connection there. But something that supports that is he's having a relationship with a woman and they're not even aware of that. So it's almost like he's got some magic way he's communicating with people on the outside. I don't know. But it really makes you wonder about, did he really stage that attempted prison break? And if he did, if they really think that, what are the odds that he actually staged his son's demise as well? You know, last week on Searchlight, we talked about a no-body homicide prosecution, and this case is a great example of that. They basically had enough evidence to prove what happened to Charlotte and hold Fred accountable for what he had done. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the strife for this family. In 1999, Jenny and her husband, who was 23 years older than her, got a divorce. They had 2 children, Adam and Charles Tyler, and unfortunately, those children would have several run-ins with the law in their adult life. I'm just really hoping that they can get that turned around and that they don't continue following in the footsteps of their grandfather. I'm also kind of surprised that that parole meeting is coming up in just a few years, but we'll have to see what happens with that. A big thank you to PayPal supporters Jennifer Dixon, Angela Welch Sola, and I want to give a special thank you to longtime fan and new PayPal supporter LaShonda Alexander. If you'd like to support the channel, please visit www.lordenarts.com. There you can sign up for PayPal, sign up for Patreon, or buy merchandise. All of it helps keep me here doing what I love doing, spending time with you. I'll be back on Wednesday with a new episode of Searchlight right here on the Lorden Arts channel.